know how you're going to give teenagers a better chance at being adults? Well, this study might point at an answer. First, keep in mind your brain tends to do this creepy thing called confabulation. It's creepy because scientists first saw this in patients whose brains were split in half. So when the right half of the brain made a decision, the left half had no clue what was going on because the split brain doesn't communicate with each other. But this is where it gets weird. When researchers asked their left brain about a decision their right brain made, their left brain didn't act like it had no idea why that decision was made. No, it confidently gave an explanation as if it knew exactly what was going on, even though it was completely in the dark for the whole thing. And it did this by often applying a model it was already familiar with and filling in the blanks from there, like, oh, I pointed at that shovel because my dad made me dig holes when I was younger. Now, schooling really works this realm of thinking across like a whole heap of their subjects, right? You learn a model, then an assessment makes you use the model in application to a task. Model, task, model, task. Don't get me wrong, it's an extremely important bit of cognition to develop, especially when it comes to being employed, but it gets your brain used to always having a hammer to rely on so it can whack around at everything as if it's all made of nails. And just for interest, here's what that looks like on a society when it's done to the extreme degree.
Why does the sun shine so bright in North Korea?
It's because the Lord and Savior Kim Jong-un.
Obviously, I'm not saying this is what schools are turning kids into, but developing your brain in environments where at the end of the day, there's always a correct answer and a correct model to follow, it doesn't quite translate you well enough into living in the real world when you're dealing with complex psychosocial situations. So what eventually happens when some kids come to navigating complex things like identity, meaning, why they're here, grief, envy, anger, they're sort of trained to automatically veer into a model of least resistance, usually something they were socially exposed to either by their parents, teachers, friends, and then they confabulate to fill in the blanks, and it appears to them to come from this place of certainty. But it's a narrow way of approaching complex topics, and it doesn't always make for good decision makers, and it's all because we don't give kids enough opportunity to get involved in this type of thinking. I'm telling you, there are structures and networks of cognition that are better prepare children for adulthood, and that's what sits at the crux of this study. It followed 65 14 to 18-year-old children into their young adulthood and found that students who were better able to do this type of thinking when they were in school had significantly better psychosocial outcomes in terms of identity development, self-esteem, and overall satisfaction with their relationships. Two more things. One, this was backed up by fMRI data showing better coordination between this network of thinking and this function of thinking. And two, this positive effect on development was independent, meaning had no relation to how smart these children were to begin with in terms of IQ or how rich they were in socioeconomics, and that's huge. What I'm trying to get to here is this idea that departments of education could shift their gears into figuring out what type of activities strengthen brain networks that are better associated with healthier outcomes in adulthood. So maybe less comparing children's brain to each other's and more about comparing what theirs may have been to themselves like a year back. Now, the questions and activities that promote transcendent thinking don't always have correct answers, so they can't really be marked in the same way. The only thing that's being tracked here is how well the child can, by themselves, come up with nuanced and more complex answers each year, and how this complexity develops as they mature. These activities exercise and engage the brain more holistically. Now, schools will attempt to do this, right? They'll ask kids something like, how do we measure success or fulfillment? And before they even get an answer, they'll flip to the next slide where they'll ask you to apply Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Look, in a future video, I'd love to go into how better connection between this network and this function gives those children in that study a better edge. But the point here is that if we train and develop brain networks more holistically, we can worry less about predicting what skills will come in demand like 10 years down the track, which we can't really do anyway. Instead, these brains will on their own have a much better chance of making better decisions for themselves and figuring out what they want to do when the time comes. They'll be better at supporting themselves, especially against psychopathology. And it doesn't have to depend on how smart or rich they were to begin with. Make transcendent thinking part of the curriculum, or at least fund more research on it.